There were Epstein's survivors sitting in that hearing room, right there, in the audience, behind the Attorney General. They came to watch. They came to hear what she would say. And what they got was Pam Bondi shouting at Democratic lawmakers, calling the ranking member of the committee a washed-up loser lawyer, pivoting to the stock market and refusing to turn around and face them. The survivors were right there, and she would not turn around. That is where this hearing went. And the most important moment in it came not from a Democrat, it came from a Republican, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, a congressman who broke with his own party to force the release of the Epstein files, a man who has been one of the loudest voices for transparency on this issue, regardless of which party it embarrasses. And what Massie told Bondi in that room was something that no amount of deflection could get around. He told her, literally the worst thing you could do to survivors, you did. Let me explain what he meant, because this is not a vague accusation, it is specific. When the Justice Department released the Epstein files, they made a choice about what to redact and what to leave visible. And here is what they chose. They redacted the names of co-conspirators, the people who allegedly helped Epstein run his trafficking operation, the powerful men whose identities remain protected behind thick black bars in the official documents. Those names were covered, but the names of Epstein's victims were not. Intimate details about survivors were left in the files. Nude photographs were left in the files. Private information that these women had never consented to making public was released to the world, while the identities of the men who abused them stayed hidden. Read that again. Victims exposed. Perpetrators protected. Massie put it on the record, and he was right. That is not an accident. That is a policy choice. And Bondi, when confronted with it, did not apologize. She did not acknowledge that a serious error had been made. She told Massie that his only interest in the Epstein files was because Trump's name appeared in them, and called him a hypocrite with Trump derangement syndrome. A Republican congressman who helped write and pass the Epstein Files Transparency Act, accused of Trump derangement syndrome by the Attorney General he was questioning, because he asked why victims were exposed while perpetrators were protected. That response tells you everything you need to know about what this hearing actually was. It was not a fact-finding exercise. It was not a transparent accounting of how the Justice Department handled one of the most significant trafficking cases in American history. It was a performance. Bondi came in with attack lines ready. She came prepared to deflect, insult, and redirect. She shouted at Democrats. She praised Trump's stock market record in the middle of a question about trafficking victims. She told one lawmaker she refused to get in the gutter while simultaneously calling the committee's ranking member a washed-up loser lawyer. The survivors sat behind her the entire time. And then, Representative Pramila Jayapal asked Bondi to do something that should have been easy. She asked her to turn around, to face the victims in the audience, and apologize for what the Justice Department's handling of the files had put them through. Bondi refused. She called it theatrics. She would not turn around. She would not look at them. She sat facing forward, toward the cameras and the lawmakers and the lights, with the survivors at her back. There is a word for what Bondi did in that hearing. It is not incompetence. Incompetence looks like confusion, like mistakes, like someone who genuinely does not understand what went wrong and is trying to figure it out. What Bondi displayed in that room was something more calculated. She knew exactly what questions were coming. She knew exactly what she was not going to answer, and she came armed with the tools to avoid answering them. Personal attacks, redirection, partisan framing, stock market numbers, all of it designed to run out the clock without ever actually addressing the core problem. The core problem is this. The Epstein Files Transparency Act required the Justice Department to release the documents by December 19, 2025. They released them in batches. Critics said the batches were too slow, too redacted, and strategically ordered to minimize politically damaging revelations. The first release contained almost nothing new. The second release contained more references to Trump. And throughout the process, the AP and other news organizations found countless examples of inconsistent, sloppy, or non-existent redactions that exposed survivors' private information while co-conspirators remained unnamed. Massie was one of the people who forced this release to happen at all. He co-sponsored the legislation. He pushed for it when members of his own party did not want to. He was in the room because he believed the public had a right to know what was in those files. And he sat across from the Attorney General and told her that the worst possible outcome for survivors had happened. Their information was out there, their photographs, their names, their intimate details, released by the very department that was supposed to protect them. Bondi's response was to call him a hypocrite. Now, let us talk about what else happened in that room, because it was not just Massie. It was the whole tenor of the hearing. Democrats pressed Bondi on whether the DOJ had questioned Trump administration officials about their ties to Epstein. Simple question: did you ask these people about their connections to this case? Bondi deflected. Rep. Becca Balint said directly, "This is pathetic. I am not asking trick questions. The American people deserve to know." And Bondi did not answer. Rep. Jamie Raskin said it even more starkly in his opening statement. He told Bondi she was running a massive Epstein cover-up right out of the Department of Justice, that she was siding with the perpetrators and ignoring the victims, that this would be her legacy unless she changed course. Bondi's response was to call Raskin a washed-up loser lawyer in a congressional hearing with Epstein survivors in the room. The survivors were there because they wanted answers. They had traveled to Washington, sat in a public hearing room, and watched a 5-hour spectacle in which the Attorney General of the United States refused to answer basic questions about why their personal information was made public while their abusers remained unnamed. They did not get an apology. They did not get an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. They got a performance designed to run out the clock and generate favorable headlines elsewhere. And that brings us back to Massie, because he represents something important in this story. He is not a Democrat trying to score points. He is not an activist with an agenda against Trump. He's a Republican congressman who believed strongly enough in transparency to break with his party and force the release of documents that powerful people did not want released. And when those documents were released in a way that harmed the very people they were supposed to help, he showed up and said so directly to the person responsible. Literally the worst thing you could do to survivors, you did. Bondi called him a hypocrite, accused him of Trump derangement syndrome, and moved on to the next question. 3 million pages of documents have been released, and still the names of the men who used Epstein's network remain largely hidden. Still, not one person who was identified by victims as a client of that operation has been charged. Still, the July 2025 memo saying there was no evidence to charge anyone stands as the official position of the Justice Department. And still, the survivors are waiting. The hearing on February 11, 2026 was supposed to be a moment of accountability. It ended with Bondi's back turned to the audience, facing forward talking about the stock market, while the women who survived Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking network sat behind her in silence. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments, when a Republican congressman who wrote the law says the worst thing you could do to survivors you did, and the Attorney General calls him a hypocrite and moves on, what does accountability even mean anymore? Because based on everything that happened in that room, it means nothing. And the survivors who sat there and watched it happen know that better than anyone. They came for answers. They left with the same silence they have always been given. And the Attorney General, who was supposed to represent justice for them, spent 5 hours making sure that silence stayed intact. And that silence is the story. Not the shouting, not the stock market deflections, not the partisan brawl that Bondi came prepared to start. The silence of over 1,000 victims whose names are now public while the names of the men who abused them are still redacted. The silence of a Republican congressman who was called a hypocrite for asking why. The silence of a room full of survivors who watched all of it happen and went home with nothing. That is the real record of what happened on February 11th, 2026, and no amount of shouting from the Attorney General will make it disappear. The files are out. The testimony is on the record. The survivors were in that room. And the question now is not whether any of this happened. It is whether anyone with the power to act on it ever will.